Now let's turn to externalities. So what an externality is the uncompensated impact of one person or one party's actions on another or other people. So let's write down that definition just so we have it. This is the uncompensated impact of one person's actions, or one person's or party action on another. So sometimes when you engage in activities or you engage in a transaction with someone, it affects, a third party. And if it's uncompensated, this is going to create an inefficiency in the market if there's kind of no intervention and there's no correction for this. And we can think of them being positive or negative. And we're going to discuss possible solutions to an inefficiency that's going to be caused by this. And in particular, what's the reason there's an inefficiency is because self-interested buyers and sellers are going to kind of ignore how their transactions affect other people. So self-interested buyers or sellers, so people, ignore external costs or benefits of their actions. So as to say their, I'll rewrite it, their actions. And this is going to cause an inefficiency in the market. So, an externality is basically the uncompensated impact of someone's actions on a third party. These can be positive or negative, so you can have a positive, something you do can have a positive effect on someone else, or it could have a negative effect. We often kind of concentrate more on the negative effects, but there's definitely positive effects too, and we're going to talk about those. Self-interested buyers, the issue here is that self-interested buyers or sellers kind of ignore the external costs or benefits on these other people. They ignore these externalities when they make decisions. And this is going to cause an inefficiency in the market. So let's first take a look at negative externalities and kind of understand graphically this inefficiency. And we'll talk about positive externalities as well as solutions to these. And in particular, we're going to concentrate on either some kind of government intervention, and that could be through regulation or it could be through incentivizing people to account for, to start to compensate other people for their actions, the consequences their actions have on these other people. So let's start with negative externalities. So this is going to be when actions by one person or one party has a negative consequence on some third party. By one individual has negative consequences on a third party. So we can think of lots of examples. A classic example would be, for a long time anyway, would be pollution and air pollution. Then we're starting to come up with solutions to that through things like carbon taxes, which we'll talk about, as well as cap and trade and things like that. But air pollution for a long time is seen as this negative externality. So people are engaging, so businesses are trying to maximize their profits, and they're not thinking about how the production of their good is maybe impacting the community through air pollution. That's changing now. We're starting to think about how to make these companies, account for the true cost of their production on society. But air pollution, for a long time, we see it as like a negative externality that we need to correct for. Same with drivers. When you're filling up your gas tank, you might not necessarily be accounting for the fact that driving a combustible engine is having a negative impact on the air quality and things like that. So there's lots of other examples as well, like texting while driving. So this is an action that some people engage in, and it's going to have potentially fatal consequences for or serious consequences for other people. That when someone's texting, they're not accounting for that, for the potential negative impacts on other people from a distracted driver. So here are two kind of main examples. We can think of lots of others, like maybe my dog Tully, if he's barking all night, that's a transaction. I chose to get a dog, but he has, my neighbors have to suffer through this negative consequence of living next to a boisterous dog. So when we start to think about externalities, we want to start to account for how society, the cost to society or the benefits to society from these goods. And so when we think about the social cost of, let's say, the production of a good is equal to the private cost, which is kind of what we've been just thinking about before, plus an external cost. And this is that negative externality. This is the negative impact on bystanders. And so instead of just thinking about private costs and how much it's costing a private company to produce a good, we want to start accounting for the fact that there's an external cost to the production of the good. And these two together make society's cost of the production of this good. And so when we think about how much this good should be produced, we should be thinking of the social cost and the social benefit of the production of this good. So let's draw a quick graph of this. So here's the quantity and here's the price. Let's say this is, could be cars, or it could be something that causes air pollution or something like that. Oil or something like that. So we're going to think about the supply curve as being the marginal cost of production. And we're going to put a subscript P on there because that's going to be the private cost of production. And then we had the demand curve, and we can think of the demand curve as the marginal benefit. And let's just say that's the private marginal benefit as well. And so when we have when we don't account for these external costs, we're getting a competitive market outcome, and maybe I'll do this in a different color, of this Q. Hopefully that's still on the screen here. So QC, that's without accounting for these external costs, we'd think that QC is the amount that's going to be produced in this market. But once we think about accounting for these external costs, that the marginal cost of production is actually not equal to MCP, but the social cost. So we might call that MCS for social, the subscript S for social, where the difference between these two curves is going to be the external cost. And that could change depending on how much they produce, so they don't have to be the same amount. This is the external cost of this particular quantity, let's say, for instance. Now, just trying to get another color here. Now, once we account for these external costs, we see that the intersection of our supply and demand curve, our social supply curve, on our private demand curve, but we're kind of assuming that there's no externalities within this demand curve or the consumption of the good, we see that the actual amount that we want produced in our society, the actual amount that maximizes total surplus, is actually this Q star, this pink or purple Q star. And so notice that, if we don't account for these negative externalities and this negative external cost, we're going to be overproducing the good at this QC. The actual amount that maximizes surplus for society is this Q star. But without any government intervention, we're not going to get to that Q star. So we're having all this deadweight loss. So think of this as, maybe I'll go way out there, overproduction of good without government intervention. Hopefully that's all on the screen. So, when we talk about solutions, we're going to be thinking about ways where the government can get us away from this QC and make people account for their external costs of their actions. For instance, we've seen things that do this, right? A tax would do this, an excise tax. We could create a wedge between buyers and sellers that makes these buyers and sellers account for these external costs and push us back to Q star if we made a tax this big. You could also have regulation where you're just forcing people to produce this Q star. When we talk about environmental economics, we'll talk about why one of these solutions might be more efficient than the other as well. But this is what negative externalities look like. So this is when your actions have a negative consequence on others. So we're usually just accounting, or before we were just accounting for private costs, but now we want to think about these external costs, which in this case happen to be negative. I mean, they're costs, I guess, but they happen to be negative. And if we have a negative externality without government intervention, we're going to overproduce the good at QC instead of when we account for these external costs, we see the actual cost of production is higher, and so we should be just producing Q star. And so we're going to overproduce the goods if we have these negative externalities without government intervention.